The smoke-filled bar buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd. Neon lights cast colorful shadows across worn leather seats and scratched wooden tables. The jukebox played classic rock while groups of friends laughed over their drinks. In the corner booth, Sarah Martinez sat quietly, nursing a beer and watching the room with careful eyes. She looked like any other young woman enjoying her evening. Her brown hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and she wore simple jeans and a fitted black top. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything more than a college student or office worker unwinding after a long week. The other patrons paid her little attention, which was exactly how she preferred it. Sarah had been undercover for 3 months now, working to gather intelligence on a suspected arms trafficking ring operating out of this coastal town. The assignment required her to blend in perfectly with the local crowd, establishing a cover identity as a freelance graphic designer who worked from home. She rented a small apartment downtown, shopped at the local grocery store, and became a regular at places like this bar. Tonight was different, though. She had finally identified her target, a man named Vincent Torres who was supposed to meet with potential buyers. The meeting was scheduled for later in the evening, and Sarah needed to position herself to observe without drawing attention. She had chosen this particular spot because it offered a clear view of the back room where such private conversations typically took place. The front door opened with a burst of cool evening air, and a group of Marines walked in. Their short haircuts and confident swagger made them easy to identify, even in civilian clothes. Sarah recognized the type immediately from her own military background, though none of them knew about her service record or current assignment. The Marines claimed a large table near the center of the room, ordering rounds of beer and shots. Their voices grew louder as the alcohol flowed, and their jokes became more boisterous. Sarah continued to monitor the situation while keeping one eye on the back room, waiting for Torres to arrive. One of the Marines, a tall man with broad shoulders and a cocky grin, began scanning the room. His gaze lingered on various women, making comments to his friends that Sarah could hear from across the bar. She ignored him completely, focusing on her phone and occasionally glancing toward the entrance. The Marine seemed to take her disinterest as a challenge. He stood up from his table, adjusting his shirt and running a hand through his short blonde hair. His friends cheered him on as he made his way across the room, weaving slightly between tables. The alcohol had clearly affected his judgment, but his confidence remained intact. "Hey there, beautiful," he said, sliding into the seat across from Sarah without invitation. "You look like you could use some company." Sarah looked up from her phone with a polite but distant smile. "Thanks, but I'm fine on my own." The Marine leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms across the back of the booth. "Come on, don't be like that. I'm Derek, by the way, United States Marine Corps, recently back from deployment. I know how to show a lady a good time. I appreciate the offer, but I'm waiting for someone," Sarah replied, her voice calm and even. She glanced toward the back room again, noting that Torres still hadn't arrived. The last thing she needed was this distraction interfering with her mission. Derek followed her gaze and smirked. "Boyfriend, don't see anyone here who looks worthy of your attention. Why don't you ditch whoever you're waiting for and let a real man take care of you?" Sarah's patience began wearing thin, but she maintained her composure. Years of training had taught her to control her emotions, even when dealing with obnoxious civilians. "I'm really not interested. Please go back to your friends." The rejection only seemed to fuel Derek's determination. He leaned forward, lowering his voice in what he probably thought was a seductive manner. "Look, I get it. You're playing hard to get. But I've been overseas for 8 months, and I know quality when I see it. We could have some real fun together." Other patrons began to notice the interaction. Some watched with mild interest, while others looked uncomfortable with Derek's increasingly aggressive approach. The bartender, a middle-aged man with graying hair, kept glancing over with obvious concern. "I've asked you politely to leave me alone," Sarah said, her voice carrying a slight edge now. "Please respect that and return to your table." Derek's friends called out encouragement from across the room, treating the situation like entertainment. One of them shouted, "Don't give up, Derek. She's just testing you." The unwanted attention was starting to compromise Sarah's position. She needed to remain invisible, but Derek's persistence was drawing eyes from all over the bar. Worse, She could see Torres entering through the back entrance, heading toward the private room where her surveillance target was supposed to take place. "Come on, sweetheart," Derek continued, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "One dance. What's the harm in that?" Sarah pulled her hand away quickly, her eyes flashing with warning. "Don't touch me. I've asked you nicely to leave. This is your last warning." Derek laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Last warning? What are you going to do? Call for help? There's nobody here who's going to choose you over a Marine." He stood up from the booth, his full height imposing as he looked down at her. The alcohol had made him bolder, and the encouragement from his friends fed his ego. He seemed to view her resistance as nothing more than a game. "Why don't you just admit you want the attention?" Derek said, his voice getting louder. "Girls like you come to places like this hoping some soldier will sweep you off your feet. Well, here I am." Sarah remained seated, but her posture changed subtly. Those trained to recognize such things would notice the slight shift in her shoulders, the way her feet positioned themselves beneath the table, the controlled breathing that suggested coiled readiness. To Derek, she still looked like an ordinary woman who was simply being stubborn. "I'm going to count to 3, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous calm that Derek completely missed. 1. Derek grinned and took a step closer to her booth. "Ooh, counting. I'm so scared. What happens when you get to 3, princess?" 2. Some of the nearby patrons had stopped their conversations entirely, sensing that something was about to happen. The bartender had picked up his phone, probably preparing to call security or the police if things escalated further. Torres was now visible in the back room, beginning his meeting with 2 other men Sarah didn't recognize. Derek reached out again, this time aiming to grab her arm and pull her from the booth. "Enough games. You're coming with me whether you like it or not." 3. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but it would replay in the minds of every witness for years to come. Sarah moved with fluid precision that seemed almost supernatural to the untrained eye. She caught Derek's wrist as he reached for her, twisted it in a direction that made him cry out in pain, and used his own momentum to pull him forward while she slid out of the booth. Before Derek could process what was happening, Sarah had spun him around and pressed him face first against the table. His arm was locked behind his back at an angle that made any movement excruciatingly painful. The entire maneuver happened so quickly and quietly that many patrons didn't even realize anything had occurred until they saw Derek's position. "I tried to ask nicely," Sarah said, her voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable authority. "But you didn't want to listen." Derek struggled against her grip, but quickly discovered that any movement sent shooting pain up his arm and shoulder. "What the hell? Let me go? You crazy bitch. I'll have you arrested." Sarah applied slightly more pressure, causing Derek to gasp. "I don't think you understand your situation. You approached me without invitation, ignored multiple requests to leave me alone, and then attempted to physically force me to leave with you. That's called assault, and I have about 30 witnesses." The bar had gone completely quiet except for the jukebox, which continued playing as if nothing had happened. Derek's friends sat frozen at their table, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. They had expected their friend to either succeed with the woman or get rejected and return to their table. This outcome had never crossed their minds. "You're hurting me," Derek whined, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "I wasn't going to hurt you or anything. I was just trying to be friendly." Sarah leaned down slightly, speaking directly into his ear so only he could hear. "Friendly? You ignored my clear refusal, made threats, and tried to physically force me to comply with your demands. That's not friendly. That's predatory behavior." The bartender had approached cautiously, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. "Miss, is everything okay here? Should I call the police?" Sarah looked up at him with a professional smile that somehow made her seem even more dangerous. "Everything's fine. This gentleman was just leaving." She released Derek's arm and stepped back, giving him space to straighten up. Derek rubbed his shoulder and wrist, glaring at her with a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and growing anger. His face was red from both the alcohol and the humiliation of being overpowered by someone half his size. "You think you're tough?" Derek snarled, his voice loud enough for the entire bar to hear. "I'm a United States Marine. I've served 3 tours overseas fighting terrorists. I'm not going to be disrespected by some little girl who thinks she knows martial arts." Sarah said nothing, simply watching him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. Her silence seemed to infuriate Derek even more than any verbal response might have. One of Derek's friends finally stood up and approached them. "Hey man, maybe we should just go. It's not worth it." "Hell no," Derek shouted, pushing his friend away. "This bitch thinks she can embarrass me in front of everyone. I'm going to teach her some respect." Derek raised his hand to strike Sarah, his face twisted with rage and alcohol-fueled aggression. The other patrons gasped, some standing up from their seats, as if to intervene. The bartender shouted a warning, and Derek's friends called out for him to stop. But Sarah was already moving. This time, her response was faster and more decisive. She caught Derek's wrist before his hand could reach her, stepped into his guard, and delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus that left him gasping for air. As he doubled over, she swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the floor. Derek lay on the sticky barroom floor, struggling to breathe, and completely unable to comprehend what had just happened to him. Sarah stood over him, not even breathing heavily from the exertion. To everyone watching, it looked like she had barely moved at all. "Stay down," Sarah advised, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "You've embarrassed yourself enough for one evening." The silence in the bar was now complete except for Derek's labored breathing and the distant sound of the jukebox. Every eye was fixed on Sarah, who looked completely composed despite having just incapacitated a trained Marine twice her size. She brushed an imaginary piece of lint from her shirt and reached for her beer as if nothing unusual had occurred. Derek's friends rushed over to help him up, their earlier bravado completely gone. They whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances at Sarah while they assisted their friend to a chair. Derek himself was still too winded to speak, though his eyes burned with humiliation and rage. The bartender approached Sarah's table again, this time with obvious respect in his demeanor. "Miss, I've got to ask, where did you learn to do that?" Sarah looked up at him with an innocent smile. "Self-defense classes. You never know what kind of trouble you might run into." It was a simple explanation, but something in her tone suggested there was much more to the story. The bartender nodded slowly, clearly sensing that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than she appeared. Meanwhile, in the back room, Torres was concluding his meeting with the potential arms buyers. Sarah had missed most of the conversation due to Derek's interruption, but she could see the men shaking hands through the window. Her mission was in jeopardy because of one drunk Marine's inability to accept rejection. Derek finally caught his breath enough to speak. "This isn't over," he wheezed, pointing at Sarah with a shaking finger. "Nobody does that to me and gets away with it. I'll find out who you are." Sarah turned to face him fully for the first time since the physical altercation ended. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet intensity that made everyone in the bar pay attention. "Let me give you some advice," she said. "You approached a stranger in a bar and tried to force yourself on her when she clearly wasn't interested. When that didn't work, you attempted to assault her. You lost that encounter badly, and now you're making threats. If I were you, I would take this as a learning experience and walk away." Derek struggled to his feet, supported by his friends. His face was still flushed, and his breathing remained labored. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes now that made Derek's friends take an unconscious step backward. "Actually," she said, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is whether you know who you're dealing with." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since the encounter began, Derek seemed to consider the possibility that he might have made a serious mistake. There was something about the way Sarah carried herself, the precision of her movements, and the calm confidence in her voice that suggested she was far more than she appeared. But Derek's pride had taken too much of a beating for him to back down completely. "We'll see about that," he muttered, allowing his friends to guide him toward the door. "This isn't finished." As the Marines left the bar, the normal sounds of conversation gradually resumed. Patrons continued to steal glances at Sarah, who had returned to her phone as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The bartender brought her a fresh beer, waving away her money when she tried to pay. "On the house," he said. "I think you've earned it." Sarah nodded her thanks and settled back into her booth. But her mind was already working on the complications Derek's interference had created. Torres was leaving the back room now, his business concluded for the evening. She had managed to identify 2 of his contacts, but she had missed the crucial details of their conversation. More importantly, Derek's threats suggested this encounter wasn't going to end quietly. If he followed through on his promise to find out who she was, it could compromise her entire operation. Sarah had worked too hard and too long to let one drunk Marine's wounded pride destroy her mission. She finished her beer and left the bar, walking casually to her car while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. The parking lot was dimly lit, with several vehicles scattered across the asphalt. Sarah had parked in a spot that offered multiple exit routes, a habit ingrained by years of training. As she reached for her car door, she heard footsteps behind her. Sarah's reflection in the window showed Derek approaching with 2 of his friends, their movements suggesting they intended to corner her. Apparently, his humiliation in the bar hadn't been enough to convince him to leave her alone. Sarah sighed and turned to face them, her keys held loosely in her hand. The parking lot was empty except for the 4 of them, and the nearest streetlight flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows across the asphalt. "I thought you might follow me out here," Sarah said, her voice carrying no surprise or fear. "This really isn't necessary, you know." Derek approached with his friends flanking him on either side. His breathing had returned to normal, and some of his confidence seemed to have returned now that they were away from the crowded bar. "You made me look like a fool in there," he said. "Now it's time for payback." Sarah noticed that one of Derek's friends looked uncomfortable with the situation, while the other seemed eager to participate in whatever Derek had planned. She filed away the information, already calculating how to handle multiple opponents if the situation escalated further. Derek moved first, throwing a right hook that would have been devastating against an ordinary opponent. But Sarah wasn't ordinary. She slipped the punch with minimal movement, letting Derek's momentum carry him past her as she pivoted on her heel. Before he could recover, she grabbed his extended arm and used a joint lock that sent him to his knees with a sharp cry of pain. "Stay down," Sarah commanded, but Derek's friend on the left was already moving. The eager one, Sarah noted, stepping forward to help his buddy. She released Derek's arm and turned to face the new threat, her movements flowing like water. The second Marine was bigger than Derek, probably outweighing Sarah by 80 pounds. He charged at her with the kind of straightforward aggression that worked well against untrained opponents. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then dropped low and swept his legs. As he fell forward, she rose up and delivered a precise elbow strike to his ribs that left him gasping on the asphalt. The third Marine, the one who had looked uncomfortable earlier, raised his hands and backed away. "Hey, I'm not part of this," he said quickly. "Derek, man, let's just go. This is crazy." But Derek was beyond reason now. The alcohol, embarrassment, and physical pain had combined to create a dangerous cocktail of rage and wounded pride. He struggled to his feet, favoring his shoulder where Sarah had applied the joint lock. "You think you're some kind of fighter?" Derek snarled. "I've killed enemy combatants with my bare hands. You're just some lucky amateur who caught me off guard." Sarah shook her head sadly. "Derek, you're making this so much worse than it has to be. I don't want to hurt you, but you're not giving me much choice." Derek's response was to pull a knife from his pocket, a tactical folder that gleamed under the flickering streetlight. The sight of the weapon changed everything. What had been a simple assault was now potentially deadly, and Sarah's demeanor shifted accordingly. "Now we're getting serious," Derek said, holding the knife in what he probably thought was a threatening manner. "Let's see how tough you are against real steel." The third Marine saw the knife and immediately pulled out his phone. "Derek, no? Put that away before someone gets killed." But Derek ignored him completely, focused entirely on Sarah. Sarah watched the knife with professional interest. Derek held it wrong, his grip too tight, and his stance too aggressive. He was clearly angry rather than tactical, which made him dangerous in an unpredictable way but less effective as a fighter. Still, a knife was a knife, and Sarah couldn't afford to underestimate the threat. "You don't know how to use that," Sarah observed calmly. "Put it away before you hurt yourself." Derek lunged forward with the blade extended, aiming for Sarah's torso. It was exactly the kind of amateur attack she had expected. Sarah sidestepped the thrust, caught Derek's wrist with both hands, and twisted sharply. The knife clattered to the asphalt as Derek screamed in pain. Before Derek could react, Sarah had him in an armbar that forced him face down on the ground. She controlled both his arm and his head position, making any resistance impossible without risking serious injury. Police. Everyone freeze. The voice came from the edge of the parking lot, where a patrol car had pulled up with its lights flashing. Two officers emerged with their weapons drawn, taking in the scene of three men on the ground and one woman standing over them. Drop any weapons and step away from each other, the lead officer commanded. Sarah immediately raised her hands and stepped away from Derek, who remained on the ground clutching his wrist. The knife was visible a few feet away, and the second Marine was still trying to catch his breath from the elbow strike to his ribs. "Officers, thank you for responding," Sarah said, her voice calm and professional. "These men followed me out of the bar and attempted to assault me. One of them drew a knife." The lead officer, a veteran with gray hair and weathered features, surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. He noted the positions of the participants, the location of the knife, and the fact that Sarah was the only one standing uninjured. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands visible and step over here," the officer said. "Sir, you on the ground, don't move. Everyone else, stay exactly where you are." Derek finally managed to sit up, still holding his injured wrist. "Officer, that woman attacked us. She's some kind of psycho. I'm a United States Marine, and she just went crazy for no reason." The third Marine, who had been filming the encounter on his phone, spoke up quickly. "That's not what happened, officer. Derek followed her out here after she rejected him in the bar. She was defending herself." The lead officer looked between the participants, clearly trying to piece together the sequence of events. His partner was checking on the second Marine, who was slowly getting to his feet while holding his ribs. "Let me get this straight," the officer said. "You three men followed this one woman out of a bar and into a dark parking lot." Derek's friend nodded reluctantly. Derek was drunk and angry because she embarrassed him inside. She tried to get him to leave her alone, but he wouldn't listen. "And then someone pulled a knife?" the officer continued. "Derek did," the third Marine confirmed. "After she put him and Tommy down without breaking a sweat. I told him to stop, but he wouldn't listen." The lead officer turned his attention to Sarah, who had remained silent during the exchange. There was something about her posture and demeanor that suggested she was completely comfortable with law enforcement situations. "Ma'am, what's your name?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied without hesitation. "And what do you do for a living, MS?" "Martinez." Sarah paused for just a moment, considering her cover story. "I'm a freelance graphic designer. I was just trying to have a quiet drink when this situation developed." The officer nodded, but his experienced eyes suggested he sensed there was more to the story. "Have you had any martial arts training?" "Some self-defense classes," Sarah said, using the same explanation she had given the bartender. "Nothing too extensive." Derek struggled to his feet, still cradling his injured wrist. "She's lying. Nobody learns to fight like that in some weekend self-defense class. She took down 3 Marines like we were children." The officer looked at Derek with obvious skepticism. 3 Marines decided to corner one woman in a dark parking lot. "And you're complaining that she was too good at defending herself." "You don't understand," Derek insisted. "The way she moved, the techniques she used, that's military-level training. Advanced stuff. She's not what she claims to be." For the first time since the police arrived, Sarah felt a flicker of concern. Derek's observation was accurate, even if his delivery was compromised by alcohol and embarrassment. Her techniques had been more precise and effective than any civilian self-defense class would teach. The lead officer's partner approached after finishing his examination of the second Marine. "This one's got a couple of cracked ribs, but nothing that requires immediate medical attention. The knife guy's wrist might be sprained, but he can move his fingers." "What about you, ma'am?" the lead officer asked Sarah. "Any injuries?" "None at all," Sarah replied honestly. The officer nodded slowly, clearly processing the implications. 3 trained Marines had attacked one woman in a parking lot, and she had emerged completely unharmed while incapacitating all of them. That level of disparity suggested either incredible luck or extraordinary skill. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to need you to come to the station to give a statement, the officer said. This is clearly a case of self-defense, but, with weapons involved, we need to document everything properly. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. A formal police report would create records that could potentially compromise her cover identity. But refusing to cooperate would be even more suspicious. Of course, officer, she agreed. I want to make sure this is all documented properly. Derek was loaded into the back of the patrol car, still protesting his treatment and insisting that Sarah was more than she appeared. His two friends were given the option to find their own transportation to the station, since they hadn't actually participated in the assault. As Sarah rode to the police station in the officer's car, she used her phone to send a coded text message to her handler. The message would alert her superiors that her cover might be compromised and that contingency plans might need to be activated. The police station was a typical small-town facility, with fluorescent lighting and beige walls that had seen better days. Sarah was led to an interview room where she waited for Detective Lisa Chun, who would be handling the case. Detective Chun was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a reputation for thoroughness. She had reviewed the preliminary reports and witness statements before entering the interview room, and something about the case had caught her attention. Ms. Martinez, thank you for waiting, Detective Chun said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. I've spoken with the officers who responded to the scene, and I have to say, this is quite an unusual case. Sarah nodded politely. I'm just glad the police arrived when they did. The situation was getting out of hand. Detective Chun opened her folder and reviewed her notes. According to the witnesses, you were able to subdue 3 men, one of whom was armed with a knife, without sustaining any injuries yourself. That's pretty remarkable. I was lucky, Sarah replied. And they were drunk. That probably helped. The detective leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah's face. Ms. Martinez, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen a lot of self-defense situations, and what happened tonight wasn't luck. That level of precision and control requires significant training. Sarah maintained her composure, but internally, she was calculating her options. Detective Chun was clearly more perceptive than the patrol officers had been. I understand your curiosity, Detective, Sarah said carefully. But I'm not sure what you're implying. Detective Chun pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a video. One of the Marines filmed part of the parking lot encounter. Would you like to see it? The video was shaky and poorly lit, but it clearly showed Sarah's precise movements as she disarmed Derek and controlled him on the ground. Even in the low-quality footage, her professional-level technique was obvious. This doesn't look like weekend self-defense classes, Detective Chun observed. This looks like someone with extensive combat training. Sarah watched the video without comment, her mind working through the implications. Her cover story was falling apart, and she needed to make a decision about how much truth to reveal. Detective Chun, Sarah said slowly, I understand your suspicions, but I need you to understand that there are some things I can't discuss without authorization from my employer. The detective's eyebrows rose. Your employer? I thought you were a freelance graphic designer. Sarah met her gaze directly. That's my cover story. My actual work is classified, and discussing it without proper clearance could create serious complications. Detective Chun set down her pen and leaned forward. Are you telling me you're some kind of law enforcement officer? I'm telling you that I work for the federal government in a capacity that requires me to maintain a low profile, Sarah said. And that tonight's incident has the potential to compromise an ongoing operation. The detective was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. She had suspected that Sarah was more than she appeared, but the implications of federal involvement changed everything. What kind of operation? Detective Chun asked. Sarah shook her head. I can't discuss that without clearance. But I can give you a contact number for my supervisor, who can verify my identity and explain the situation. Detective Chun accepted the phone number and stepped out of the room to make the call. Sarah used the time alone to consider her options. Her cover was blown, at least partially, but the operation might still be salvageable if her handler could contain the situation. 20 minutes later, Detective Chun returned with a much more serious expression. I just had a very interesting conversation with someone who identified himself as Special Agent William Hayes. He confirmed your identity and explained that you're working undercover on a federal case. Sarah nodded, relieved that her handler had been able to intervene quickly. I hope you understand why I couldn't be more forthcoming initially. Agent Hayes also explained that your cover identity needs to be protected, Detective Chen continued. He's arranging for the federal authorities to take over this case, which means the local charges against the Marines will be handled at a higher level. This was both good and bad news for Sarah. Federal involvement would protect her cover story, but it would also mean increased scrutiny of her operation. Her superiors would not be pleased that a simple undercover assignment had attracted so much attention. What happens now? Sarah asked. Detective Chen closed her folder. Now you go back to being a graphic designer, and I pretend this conversation never happened. The Marines will be transferred to federal custody, and their charges will be handled through military courts rather than civilian ones. Sarah stood up, shaking the detective's hand. Thank you for your discretion. Just one question, Detective Chen said. What Derek said about your fighting ability. He was right, wasn't he? You really are military trained. Sarah paused at the door. Let's just say that my self-defense classes were very thorough. As Sarah left the police station, she knew her mission had been fundamentally altered. Derek's persistence and observational skills had forced her to reveal more than she had intended, even if the situation was now contained. Her handler would need to reassess whether her cover identity was still viable. But there was another problem she hadn't anticipated. Derek was smart enough to know that something didn't add up and determined enough to keep digging. Even in federal custody, he would likely continue asking questions about the woman who had humiliated him so thoroughly. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her handler. Safe house. 1 hour. We need to talk. The message was brief, but clear. Her cover was compromised, and decisions needed to be made about the future of the operation. As Sarah drove through the quiet streets toward the designated meeting point, she reflected on how quickly a routine surveillance mission had spiraled out of control. All because one drunk Marine couldn't take no for an answer. But, as she considered the evening's events, Sarah realized that Derek's behavior had revealed something important about his character. His persistence, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that he was outmatched, suggested either remarkable stupidity or genuine conviction that something was wrong. Given his military background and observational skills, Sarah was beginning to suspect it might be the latter, and that could make him a much more dangerous problem than she had initially realized. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in a residential complex across town. Sarah parked several blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, checking for surveillance as she moved. Her training made such precautions automatic, even though she doubted Derek's friends would be capable of following her. Special Agent Hayes was waiting for her, along with another agent Sarah didn't recognize. Both men looked serious, which was never a good sign in this line of work. Sarah, Hayes said as she entered the apartment. We have a problem. Sarah settled into a chair, noting that both agents remained standing. Their body language suggested this conversation would not be pleasant. How bad? She asked. The unknown agent, a tall man with silver hair, answered. Potentially very bad. The Marine who attacked you, Derek Patterson, comes from a family with significant political connections. His father is a retired general with friends in Congress. Sarah felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. Political complications were the worst possible outcome for an undercover operation. There's more, Hayes continued. Patterson has already started making calls from the holding cell. He's convinced that you're some kind of foreign operative, and he's demanding a full investigation into your identity. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a simple bar fight was now threatening to involve congressional oversight and political scandal. What are our options? Sarah asked. The silver-haired agent, who introduced himself as Director James Walsh, sat down across from her. That depends on how committed you are to completing this mission. We can extract you tonight and close down the operation, or we can try to salvage your cover and continue. Sarah considered the options. 3 months of work would be wasted if she abandoned the mission now, and Torres would likely disappear if he suspected federal surveillance. But staying meant risking exposure at the highest levels of government. What would it take to salvage the cover? She asked. Director Walsh opened a file folder. We need to create a backstory that explains your fighting ability without revealing your true identity. Military service record, perhaps, or law enforcement background. Something that satisfies Patterson's suspicions without compromising the operation. Sarah nodded slowly. It was risky, but potentially workable. What about Patterson himself? He's being transferred to a military facility for psychological evaluation, Hayes explained. The official story is that his behavior indicates possible PTSD or alcohol-related issues. It should keep him quiet for a while. And his friends. They're cooperating fully, Director Walsh said. Apparently, they're embarrassed by Patterson's behavior and don't want to be associated with it. They've agreed to support whatever story we need them to. Sarah weighed the risks and benefits. Staying meant living with the constant threat that her enhanced background would draw unwanted attention. Leaving meant abandoning an operation that could prevent weapons from falling into terrorist hands. I'll stay, she decided. But I want backup protocols in place in case things get worse. Director Walsh nodded approvingly. We'll create a military service record that shows you served in military police before leaving to pursue civilian life. It explains your training without revealing your true specialty. Sarah agreed to the plan, though she knew it would make her job more difficult. People would now be watching for signs that she was more than a simple graphic designer, which would require even more careful behavior. As the meeting concluded, Hayes handed her a new set of identification documents. Your legend now includes an honorable discharge after 4 years in the Army. Military police, stationed in Germany. It's a good cover. Explains your skills without making you too interesting. Sarah studied the documents, memorizing the details of her new background. In a few hours, she would need to be completely comfortable with this expanded identity. One more thing, Director Walsh added. Patterson's psychological evaluation is scheduled to last 2 weeks. That should give you time to wrap up the surveillance on Torres before he's released. Sarah nodded, understanding the urgency. She had 2 weeks to complete her mission before Derek Patterson returned with even more questions and possibly more resources to investigate her identity. As she left the safe house, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in a single evening. A drunk Marine's unwanted advances had forced her to reveal capabilities that were supposed to remain hidden, potentially compromising an operation she had spent months developing. 2 days after the incident at the bar, Sarah resumed her surveillance of Vincent Torres with a modified approach. Her new cover story required subtle changes in behavior. She could now demonstrate awareness of tactical situations without raising suspicion, but she had to be careful not to appear too professional. Torres had moved his operations to a different location, a warehouse on the outskirts of town that specialized in importing electronics. Sarah established a new observation post in an abandoned building across the street, using high-powered telephoto equipment to monitor the facility. The warehouse buzzed with activity during regular business hours, but Sarah noticed unusual patterns in the evening. Trucks would arrive without company markings, unload cargo that was immediately transferred to waiting vehicles, and disappear before dawn. The timing and secrecy suggested these weren't legitimate electronic shipments. Sarah documented each suspicious delivery, photographing license plates, and noting the descriptions of personnel involved. Her 3 months of preparation were finally paying dividends as she identified the key players in Torres's operation. But her concentration was broken by an unexpected phone call from Detective Chun. Ms. Martinez, I'm sorry to bother you, the detective said, but I wanted to give you a heads up about something. That Marine from the other night, Derek Patterson, he's been making inquiries about you. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of inquiries? He's been calling our department, asking for copies of the police report. He's also been contacting local businesses, asking if anyone knows you. Apparently, he's convinced that you're not who you claim to be. This was exactly what Sarah had feared. Derek's obsession with proving his suspicions could unravel her entire operation if he stumbled across the wrong information. Has he discovered anything? Sarah asked. Not yet, Detective Chin replied. But he's persistent, and he's got friends helping him. I thought you should know in case he approaches you directly. Sarah thanked the detective and immediately contacted her handler. The situation was escalating beyond their ability to control through official channels. Derek Patterson was conducting his own investigation, and his military connections gave him resources that civilian authorities couldn't easily counter. Agent Hayes met with Sarah at a coffee shop downtown. choosing a public location that would appear normal to any surveillance. They sat at a corner table where their conversation couldn't be overheard. Patterson's been busy, Hayes confirmed. Our sources indicate he's contacted former military colleagues who now work in intelligence. He's trying to use their access to verify your background. Sarah stirred her coffee absently. How much can they actually discover? That depends on how deep they dig, Hayes replied. Your military legend should hold up under casual scrutiny, but if they access classified databases, things get complicated. The implication was clear. If Derek's investigation reached certain levels, it could expose not only Sarah's true identity, but also the existence of her current operation. The consequences would extend far beyond one blown cover. What are our options? Sarah asked. Hayes leaned forward slightly. We can try to discredit Patterson. His behavior at the bar gives us leverage. We can portray him as an unstable individual with alcohol problems and anger issues. Sarah considered the suggestion, but shook her head. That might work short-term, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. He's smart enough to know what he saw, and discrediting him might just make him more determined. The alternative is to abort the operation, Hayes said. We can extract you tonight and shut down the surveillance. Sarah glanced across the street at the warehouse where Torres conducted his business. After months of work, she was finally close to identifying his entire network. Walking away now would mean starting over from scratch, assuming they ever got another opportunity. Give me 48 hours, Sarah said. I think I can wrap up the surveillance and get what we need before Patterson becomes a real problem. Hayes looked skeptical. That's cutting it very close. If he exposes you while you're still in the field. I understand the risks, Sarah interrupted. But we're too close to the end game to quit now. Hayes agreed reluctantly, but insisted on additional backup protocols. Sarah would have a team standing by for immediate extraction if the situation deteriorated further. That evening, Sarah returned to her observation post with renewed urgency. She needed to document enough evidence to justify federal raids on Torres's operation before Derek Patterson's investigation forced her to abandon the mission. The warehouse was unusually busy that night, with multiple deliveries scheduled throughout the evening. Sarah recognized several vehicles from previous surveillance, but there were also new players she hadn't seen before. The increased activity suggested something significant was happening. Around midnight, a convoy of 3 black SUVs arrived at the warehouse. Sarah adjusted her camera settings to capture clear images despite the low light conditions. The vehicles were expensive and well-maintained, suggesting their occupants had significant resources. 6 men emerged from the SUVs, all dressed in expensive suits, and carrying themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to power. Sarah recognized one of them from intelligence briefings, Anton Volkov, a Russian businessman suspected of arms trafficking on an international scale. This was the breakthrough Sarah had been hoping for. Torres wasn't just running a local weapons smuggling operation. He was connected to international dealers at the highest levels. The intelligence value of this discovery would justify months of investigation. Sarah began photographing everything, documenting the faces of Volkov's associates and the license plates of their vehicles. This was the kind of evidence that could lead to RICO prosecutions and international arrest warrants. But her concentration was broken by the sound of footsteps on the metal stairs leading to her observation post. Sarah immediately switched off her camera and drew her sidearm, moving to a position where she could observe the entrance without being seen. The footsteps were careful and deliberate, suggesting someone with tactical training. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Had Torres discovered her surveillance? Was this an unrelated security patrol? Or had Derek Patterson somehow tracked her down? A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim lighting from the street below. Sarah could see it was a man, approximately 6 feet tall, with a military bearing. As he stepped into the room, the available light revealed Derek Patterson's face. I knew I'd find you here, Derek said quietly, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The question is, what exactly are you doing? Sarah remained hidden behind a concrete pillar, her weapon ready but not yet visible. Derek was alone, which suggested this was a personal investigation rather than an official operation. I know you're in here, Derek continued. I followed you from your apartment. Very professional surveillance detection route, by the way. the kind they teach in advanced training programs. Sarah weighed her options. Derek's presence compromised her observation post and potentially exposed her to Torres's security. But shooting a Marine would create problems that would end her career, regardless of the circumstances. "You can come out," Derek said. "I'm not here to arrest you or cause trouble. I just want to know who you really are and what you're really doing." Against her better judgment, Sarah stepped out from behind the pillar, keeping her weapon lowered but ready. Derek turned toward her, voice, his own hands clearly visible and empty. "Hello, Derek," Sarah said. "I was hoping you'd gotten tired of playing detective." Derek smiled grimly. "Not even close. That little demonstration you put on the other night convinced me you're military, but not just any military. The techniques you used, the precision, that's special operations level training." Sarah studied his face in the dim light. Derek was sober now, and his earlier aggression had been replaced by focused determination. This version of him was much more dangerous than the drunk Marine she had encountered at the bar. "What makes you think that?" Sarah asked, curious about his analytical process. "The joint locks you used were advanced jujitsu, not basic self-defense," Derek explained. "The way you controlled multiple opponents simultaneously showed tactical awareness that takes years to develop. And the speed with which you disarmed me. That's combat experience, not training exercises." Sarah had to admit his analysis was accurate, even if his conclusions were problematic for her cover. "You're very observant." "Special forces?" Derek asked directly. Sarah considered her options. Derek had already demonstrated that he wouldn't accept simple denials, and his investigation was becoming a threat to her mission. Perhaps partial honesty would satisfy his curiosity while protecting her operation. "Military intelligence," Sarah said, choosing a cover story that was close enough to the truth to be believable. "But I'm not active duty anymore." Derek nodded as if this confirmed his suspicions. "What's your interest in that warehouse?" Sarah glanced toward the building where Volkov and his associates were still conducting business. Her original mission was now secondary to managing Derek's interference. "I can't discuss that," Sarah said. "It's classified." "Classified by whom?" Derek pressed. "If you're not active duty, who are you working for?" The questions were becoming too specific for Sarah to answer without revealing information that could compromise her operation. She needed to find a way to satisfy Derek's curiosity while protecting her mission. "Derek, I understand your curiosity, but there are some things I can't explain," Sarah said. "What I can tell you is that I'm one of the good guys, and what I'm doing here is important." Derek studied her face, clearly trying to determine whether he could trust her. "The other night, you could have really hurt me. Permanently. But you didn't. That says something about your character." Sarah was surprised by the observation. She had expected Derek to focus on his humiliation rather than her restraint. "I don't hurt people unless I have to," Sarah said. "You were drunk and angry, not evil." Derek was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Look, I know I was an ass that night. The alcohol, the embarrassment, my ego. I handled the whole situation badly. But I can't let go of the feeling that something important is happening here." Sarah glanced at her watch. Volkov's meeting had been going on for over an hour, which meant it would probably conclude soon. She needed to resume surveillance before missing crucial intelligence. "Derek, I need you to trust me on this," Sarah said. "What I'm doing here is legal and necessary. But if you interfere, you could compromise an operation that's taken months to develop." Derek followed her gaze toward the warehouse. "What kind of operation?" Sarah made a quick decision. Derek's military background meant he might understand the importance of her mission, even if she couldn't reveal all the details. "The people in that warehouse are trafficking illegal weapons," Sarah said. "I've been gathering evidence to shut them down before those weapons reach terrorist organizations." Derek's demeanor changed immediately. His personal curiosity was replaced by professional interest as he processed the implications of Sarah's statement. "How long have you been watching them?" he asked. 3 months, Sarah replied. "And tonight might be my best chance to identify their international connections." Derek looked toward the warehouse with new understanding. "The men who arrived in the SUVs, they're important?" Sarah nodded. "Very important. If I can document their involvement, it could lead to arrests across multiple countries." Derek was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with conflicting impulses. His investigation had revealed information that went far beyond his personal interest in Sarah's identity. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. Sarah was surprised by the offer. She had expected Derek to continue demanding answers, not volunteer to help with her mission. "I need you to leave," Sarah said. "Your presence here compromises my surveillance and could alert the targets that they're being watched." Derek shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere, but I can help instead of hindering. I've got surveillance training too, and an extra pair of eyes might be useful." Sarah considered the offer. Derek's military background would make him a competent observer, and his cooperation would be preferable to his continued interference. But involving a civilian in an active intelligence operation violated numerous protocols. "It's not that simple," Sarah explained. "This is a federal investigation with strict rules about who can participate." Derek smiled. "Then, don't tell anyone I'm here. As far as your superiors know, you completed the surveillance alone." Before Sarah could respond, activity at the warehouse caught her attention. Volkov and his associates were leaving the building, moving quickly toward their vehicles. Sarah immediately raised her camera and began photographing the group. Derek positioned himself at a different window, providing a second angle of observation. "Black SUV, license plate 779 Alpha Delta Charlie," he said quietly. Sarah noted the information while continuing to photograph. Derek's assistance was professional and unobtrusive, suggesting he understood the importance of the surveillance. "Second vehicle, partial plate visible, 46-something Bravo," Derek continued. "3 men, one carrying what looks like a briefcase." The convoy departed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the warehouse quiet except for Torres's regular security personnel. Sarah lowered her camera and began reviewing the images she had captured. "Did you get what you needed?" Derek asked. Sarah scrolled through the photographs on her camera's display. The images were clear and well-composed, showing faces and license plates that could be used to identify Volkov's entire organization. "Yes," Sarah said. "This is exactly what we needed." Derek approached and looked at the camera display. "The Russian guy in the expensive suit. I've seen his face before. Defense intelligence briefings about international arms dealers." Sarah was impressed by Derek's recognition. "Anton Volkov. We've been trying to connect him to American dealers for 2 years." Derek nodded grimly. "And now you have photographic evidence of him meeting with your targets." Sarah began packing her equipment, preparing to leave the observation post. Her mission was essentially complete, but she still needed to process the intelligence and coordinate with her handlers. "What happens next?" Derek asked. "I report to my supervisors. They analyze the intelligence, and federal agents conduct raids based on what we've documented," Sarah explained. "With luck, we'll roll up the entire network within the next few days." Derek helped her carry equipment down the stairs, their earlier conflict replaced by professional cooperation. "What about your cover identity?" Sarah paused at the bottom of the stairs. Derek's investigation had forced her to reveal more than she had intended, but his assistance tonight had been valuable. "I'll maintain it until the operation concludes," Sarah said. "After that, I'll probably get a new assignment in a different location." Derek was quiet as they walked to their vehicles, which were parked several blocks away. "Look, I owe you an apology for the other night, and for stalking you afterward. I let my pride get in the way of good judgment." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "Derek, you were right about me not being who I claimed. Your instincts were good, even if your methods were questionable." Derek smiled ruefully. "Military intelligence, huh? I should have guessed. The way you handled that situation was too precise to be anything else." Sarah nodded. "Your observation skills are impressive. In a different situation, those skills could be very valuable." Derek looked at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I mean that people with your background and analytical ability are always in demand," Sarah explained. "If you ever get tired of being a regular Marine, there are other opportunities available." Derek considered the suggestion. "You're talking about intelligence work?" "I'm talking about using your skills to serve your country in ways that might be more interesting than standard military service," Sarah said carefully. Derek was quiet for several minutes as they reached their vehicles. "Would I be working with people like you?" Sarah smiled. "If you're lucky." Derek laughed, the first genuine humor he had shown since their encounter at the bar. "After tonight, I'm not sure whether that would be a blessing or a curse." Sarah climbed into her car and rolled down the window. Derek, what happened tonight needs to stay between us. The operation isn't finished, and premature disclosure could compromise other investigations. Derek nodded seriously. Understood. But can I ask you one more question? What's that? Your real name. Is it actually Sarah Martinez? Sarah paused before answering. That's close enough to the truth. Derek smiled and stepped back from her car. Good luck with your mission, Sarah Martinez. Try not to beat up any more Marines. Sarah drove away, leaving Derek standing in the empty parking lot. Their confrontation had evolved from hostility to cooperation, but she knew the situation remained delicate. Derek's curiosity had been partially satisfied, but he now possessed information that could compromise her operation if he chose to share it. As Sarah returned to her apartment, she reflected on the evening's events. Her mission was nearly complete, but Derek Patterson had become an unexpected complication. His military background and analytical skills made him a potential asset, but his independence and curiosity made him difficult to control. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Hayes. Emergency meeting. Safe house. 1 hour. The message suggested that something had changed dramatically while she was conducting surveillance. Sarah hoped it wasn't related to Derek's investigation, but she had learned not to underestimate his ability to complicate her life. The safe house was dark when Sarah arrived, with only Agent Hayes waiting inside. His expression was grim, which immediately put Sarah on alert. We have a problem, Hayes said without preamble. Patterson's investigation has reached some very high levels. Sarah felt her stomach drop. How high? Congressional Oversight Committee, Hayes replied. His father called in favors with senators who have access to classified programs. They're demanding a full briefing on any federal operations involving undercover personnel in this area. Sarah sank into a chair, processing the implications. Congressional oversight meant her operation would be exposed at the highest levels of government, regardless of its success. How much time do we have? She asked. The briefing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, Hayes said. Which means we need to extract you tonight and close down the operation immediately. Sarah thought about the intelligence she had gathered just hours earlier. The photographs of Volkov meeting with Torres represented months of work and could prevent weapons from reaching terrorist organizations. I got what we needed, Sarah said. Tonight's surveillance documented the international connection. We can proceed with arrests based on the evidence I collected. Hayes looked surprised. You completed the mission? Sarah described her observation of Volkov's meeting, showing Hayes the photographs on her camera. As he reviewed the images, his expression changed from concern to excitement. This is exceptional work, Hayes said. With this evidence, we can take down the entire network. Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Derek Patterson's investigation had forced an premature end to her cover identity. What about Patterson? She asked. Hayes was still studying the photographs. Patterson's investigation becomes irrelevant if we can show that our operation was successful. Congressional oversight committees don't question results, only methods. Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. If federal raids based on her intelligence resulted in significant arrests, Derek's curiosity would be overshadowed by the operation's success. When do the raids begin? Sarah asked. Hayes checked his watch. 6 hours. Federal agents are already moving into position. By morning, Torres and his entire organization will be in custody. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. 3 months of careful work would finally culminate in arrests that could prevent significant harm to American interests. And Volkov? She asked. International arrest warrant, Hayes replied. Interpol is see the federal raids began at dawn, coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously to prevent the targets from warning each other. Sarah watched from a command vehicle parked 2 miles from the warehouse, monitoring radio communications as teams moved into position. Agent Hayes sat beside her, directing operations through encrypted radio channels. Dozens of federal agents, local police, and specialized tactical units participated in the operation, all based on intelligence Sarah had gathered over 3 months of surveillance. Team Alpha in position at the warehouse. Came the first radio report. No visible security, minimal resistance expected. Sarah recognized the voice of Special Agent Martinez, the team leader responsible for arresting Vincent Torres. She had briefed him personally on the warehouse layout and security procedures, using detailed observations from her surveillance. Team Bravo ready at the dock facility, reported another voice. Multiple vehicles on site, several suspects visible. The dock facility was Torres's secondary location, where weapons were transferred from ships to ground transportation. Sarah had identified this site during her second month of surveillance, tracking vehicles between the warehouse and the waterfront. Team Charlie has the residential targets, came the third report, standing by for simultaneous execution. The residential raids would capture Torres's lieutenants at their homes, preventing them from destroying evidence or escaping once they learned about arrests at the business locations. Agent Hayes checked his watch and reached for the radio microphone. All teams, execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, go. The radio exploded with activity as teams moved simultaneously. Sarah listened to the reports, tracking the progress of each raid through the professional communications of the federal agents. Alpha Team, warehouse secure. Multiple suspects in custody. Large quantity of weapons recovered. Bravo Team, dock facility contained. 6 arrests made. Searching for additional contraband. Charlie Team, for residences cleared. 7 suspects in custody. Documents and electronic devices seized. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as each report confirmed successful arrests. Months of careful work were paying off exactly as planned, validating every risk she had taken to gather intelligence. Agent Hayes, we have Torres in custody, came Martinez's voice over the radio. He was attempting to destroy documents when we breached the warehouse. Hayes smiled grimly. What kind of documents? Shipping manifests, payment records, contact lists. Looks like he was trying to protect his suppliers and customers. This was exactly the kind of evidence prosecutors needed to build comprehensive cases against the entire network. Sarah had observed Torres handling these documents during her surveillance, but she hadn't been able to access them without compromising her cover. Any sign of the Russian connection? Hayes asked. Negative on Volkov personally, but we found documentation of the meeting your operative observed. Financial records showing payments from Russian accounts, shipping schedules that match your intelligence reports. Sarah leaned back in her seat, relieved that her surveillance had provided actionable intelligence. The photographs she had taken of Volkov were now corroborated by financial evidence found during the raids. Hayes switched to a different radio frequency. International liaison, this is command. Update on Volkov's status. A new voice responded, speaking with a slight accent that suggested European law enforcement. Volkov taken into custody at Frankfurt Airport 3 hours ago. German authorities are holding him pending extradition hearings. Sarah was amazed at the speed and coordination of the international response. Her surveillance had triggered law enforcement actions across multiple countries, all happening simultaneously to prevent suspects from warning each other. Outstanding work, Hayes said into the radio. Begin prisoner processing and evidence cataloging. This is going to be a complex prosecution. As the initial excitement of the raids settled into routine police work, Hayes turned his attention to Sarah. Congratulations. Your intelligence just took down one of the most significant arms trafficking networks we've encountered. Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and exhaustion. 3 months of maintaining a false identity while conducting dangerous surveillance had finally concluded successfully. What's the damage assessment? Sarah asked. Hayes consulted a preliminary report on his tablet. 17 arrests across 4 locations. Approximately 200 illegal weapons recovered, ranging from handguns to military-grade explosives. Financial records indicating transactions worth over $10 million. The numbers were impressive, but Sarah was most interested in the strategic impact. What about the international connections? Volkov's arrest has triggered investigations in 6 countries, Hayes explained. His financial records are exposing weapons trafficking networks across Europe and Asia. Your surveillance may have disrupted operations we didn't even know existed. Sarah was pleased that her work would have implications beyond the immediate case. Stopping Torres was important, but preventing international weapons trafficking would save lives on a much larger scale. Agent Hayes, we need to discuss the Patterson situation, Sarah said, returning to the complication that had threatened her operation. Hayes looked up from his tablet. Actually, that problem may have solved itself. Patterson's commanding officer received a call this morning from someone very high up the chain of command. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What kind of call? The kind that suggests Patterson's investigation has been noticed by people who prefer their operations to remain classified, Hayes said carefully. He's been transferred to a different unit, effective immediately. Sarah wasn't surprised by this development. Derek's investigation had attracted attention from congressional oversight committees, which meant various intelligence agencies had taken notice of his activities. Where did they transfer him? Sarah asked. Hayes smiled enigmatically. Somewhere his curiosity and analytical skills will be properly utilized. Let's leave it at that. Sarah understood the implication. Derek's investigation had demonstrated abilities that made him valuable to intelligence organizations, even if his methods were unconventional. His transfer was probably a recruitment opportunity disguised as a disciplinary action. Will I have any further contact with him? Sarah asked. That depends on your next assignment, Hayes replied. But I suspect your paths may cross again in a professional capacity. Sarah wasn't sure whether that prospect was appealing or concerning. Derek had proven to be both a complication and an asset, depending on whether he was working with her or against her. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Congratulations on your successful mission. Perhaps we'll work together next time. Sarah showed the message to Hayes, who read it with amusement. He's persistent, I'll give him that. Not many people can track down classified phone numbers. Sarah deleted the message, but found herself curious about Derek's new assignment. His investigation had revealed impressive analytical abilities, and his cooperation during her final surveillance had shown he could work effectively with intelligence operatives. Agent Hayes, I need to ask about my next assignment, Sarah said. This operation may have compromised my current cover identity. Hayes nodded seriously. We're working on that. Your cover held up well enough to complete the mission, but Derek Patterson's investigation attracted too much attention for you to continue using the same identity. Sarah had expected this outcome. Even successful operations sometimes required new identities if too many people became curious about an operative's background. What are the options? She asked. Hayes consulted his tablet again. Several possibilities. There's an arms trafficking investigation in Miami that could use your expertise. A money laundering case in Seattle that requires someone with your financial background. Or, Sarah waited for him to continue. There's a joint task force being formed to investigate international weapons trafficking. Multiple agencies, multiple countries. Your success with the Torres operation makes you a prime candidate. Sarah was intrigued by the international opportunity. Working with foreign intelligence services would expand her skills and experience while addressing threats that crossed national borders. What would that assignment involve? She asked. Hayes smiled. I can't give you details here, but it would involve working with some very talented people from various organizations. People who have demonstrated analytical abilities and curiosity about complex operations. Sarah understood the hint. Derek Patterson's transfer and her potential new assignment might not be coincidental. Intelligence agencies often recruited people who showed exceptional abilities, even if their initial approach was unorthodox. When do you need an answer? Sarah asked. Take some time to consider it, Hayes replied. You've been undercover for 3 months, which is mentally and emotionally exhausting. Rest up, and we'll discuss your options next week. Sarah agreed to the timeline, though she was already leaning toward accepting the international assignment. Working with foreign intelligence services would be challenging, but it would also provide opportunities to develop new skills and tackle larger problems. As the command vehicle prepared to return to headquarters, Sarah took one last look at the warehouse where she had spent so many hours conducting surveillance. The building was now surrounded by federal agents and crime scene technicians, processing evidence that would support prosecutions for years to come. 3 months of her life had led to this moment, and Sarah felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her work would prevent weapons from reaching terrorist organizations. The personal sacrifices required for undercover work were justified by results like this. But her thoughts were interrupted by another text message, this one from Agent Hayes. Preliminary debriefing in 1 hour. Director Walsh wants to discuss your performance personally. Sarah realized that her successful operation had attracted attention at the highest levels of her organization. Director Walsh didn't personally debrief operatives unless their work had significant strategic importance. The debriefing took place in a secure conference room at federal headquarters, with Director Walsh, Agent Hayes, and two other officials Sarah didn't recognize. The atmosphere was formal but positive, suggesting her work was being evaluated favorably. Agent Martinez, Director Walsh began. Your performance on the Torres operation was exceptional. 3 months of undercover work culminating in 17 arrests and the disruption of an international trafficking network. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but remained quiet, waiting for the director to continue. However, the complications created by Maureen Patterson's investigation have raised some concerns about operational security, Walsh continued. We need to discuss how to prevent similar situations in the future. Sarah had expected this conversation. Derek's investigation had nearly compromised her mission, and her superiors needed to understand what had gone wrong. Sir, Patterson's suspicions were based on accurate observations, Sarah explained. My defensive techniques during the initial encounter were more advanced than my cover story could support. One of the unknown officials leaned forward. Could you have handled the situation differently without compromising your safety? Sarah considered the question carefully. Given the circumstances, I believe I used the minimum force necessary to protect myself. However, I could have been more careful about the techniques I employed. Director Walsh nodded. The review board agrees with that assessment. Your response was appropriate for the threat, but it revealed capabilities that raised questions about your background. Sarah understood the implication. Her training had prepared her to handle dangerous situations, but it had also taught her techniques that were difficult to explain with a civilian cover story. What are the recommendations for future operations? Sarah asked. The second unknown official answered. Enhance cover stories that can support defensive capabilities. More detailed legends that include military or law enforcement backgrounds when appropriate. This made sense to Sarah. Her current assignment had required a purely civilian identity, but future missions might benefit from covers that explained her combat skills. There's also the question of how to handle curious individuals like Patterson, Director Walsh added. His investigation demonstrated both the risks and potential benefits of having observant people take interest in our operations. Sarah was curious about this perspective. Benefits. Patterson's analytical abilities and persistence are exactly the qualities we look for in intelligence operatives, Walsh explained. His investigation was problematic for your operation, but it also demonstrated skills that could be valuable to our organization. Sarah thought about Derek's cooperation during her final surveillance. His military background and observational skills had indeed been helpful once he understood the situation. Is that why he was transferred? Sarah asked. Director Walsh smiled. Let's just say that talented individuals often find opportunities to use their skills in new ways. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering operational details, lessons learned, and recommendations for future missions. Sarah's performance was rated as exceptional despite the complications, and she was commended for adapting to unexpected challenges. As the meeting concluded, Director Walsh addressed her directly. Agent Martinez, your success on this operation has earned you consideration for more advanced assignments. Are you interested in expanding your role within the organization? Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. I'm ready for new challenges. Excellent, Walsh replied. Agent Hayes will brief you coordinating with Russian authorities. He'll be taken into custody before he can leave the country. Sarah leaned back in her chair, finally, allowing herself to relax. Her mission was complete, and Derek Patterson's investigation would become a footnote once the arrests were made public. But, as she prepared to leave the safe house for the final time, Sarah couldn't help thinking about Derek's offer to help. His skills and instincts would indeed be valuable in intelligence work, and his cooperation tonight had demonstrated his potential. Perhaps Derek Patterson's curiosity would lead him down a path similar to her own, and perhaps their adversarial relationship would eventually become something more collaborative. Only time would tell whether Derek's investigation would end with answers or with new questions about his own future. But there was no going back now. She had a new cover identity to maintain and a mission to complete before Derek Patterson's curiosity could cause any more problems. The next morning, Sarah returned to her apartment and began implementing her new backstory. She updated her social media profiles to include subtle references to military service, placed a few Army memorabilia items around her apartment, and practiced talking about her fictional time in Germany. The attention to detail was crucial. If anyone investigated her background now, they would find evidence of military service that explained her fighting ability without raising additional questions about her current activities. But, as Sarah prepared for another day of surveillance, she couldn't shake the feeling that Derek Patterson wasn't going to be satisfied with the official explanations. His behavior in the bar and parking lot suggested someone who didn't give up easily, especially when his pride was involved. Sarah had dealt with dangerous criminals, foreign agents, and terrorist sympathizers during her career. But she was beginning to suspect that one stubborn, embarrassed Marine might prove to be her most challenging opponent yet. "You made yourself look like a fool," Sarah corrected. "I just defended myself when you wouldn't take no for an answer. You can walk away right now, and we can pretend this never happened." Derek laughed, but the sound was cold and angry. "Walk away? After what you did to me in there? I don't think so. You're going to apologize, and then we're going to discuss how you're going to make this right." The threat was clear, and Sarah's patience finally reached its limit. She had tried to handle the situation diplomatically, given Derek multiple opportunities to walk away, and attempted to defuse the tension without revealing her true capabilities. But Derek's persistence was forcing her hand. "Last chance," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Turn around, get in your car, and drive away. Don't make me do something we'll both regret." Derek's response was to step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not in control here anymore, sweetheart. Time to learn what happens when you mess with a Marine." Sarah almost felt sorry for him. Derek had no idea that he was threatening a Special Forces operative with years of combat experience and training that made his Marine Corps background look like basic self-defense. She had been trying to protect him from himself, but he wasn't giving her any choice. "All right," Sarah said, settling into a balanced stance. "But remember, you asked for this."